All right, folks. Well, it is Monday, and we are going to continue talking about the philosophes. We started last class talking about some of the best known intellectual figures of the 1700s. These are the philosophes, and the reason they're referred to as philosophes is because that's the French word for philosopher. And they were the popularizers of the Enlightenment during the 1700s, which ultimately contributed to this spread of a feeling amongst the intellectual class of Europe at this time. Relatively well-educated, professional type peoples, professors, bankers, lawyers, people of this nature. They, they started to emphasize certain elements of the Enlightenment, okay, of the teachings of the Enlightenment. And when we talk about guys like Voltaire, for example, Voltaire, probably one of the more influential of the figures. And so anyhow, sorry, I'm talking with other teachers about the network problems. I don't know if you guys for your other classes today are going to run into this, but just to let you know, it sounds like the CNUSD website is kind of on the fritz this morning. My CNUSD isn't loading up. They're having problems with email. They're having problems with other things. So I'm sorry that I sound distracted this morning. As I said, it's just been a really unusual morning. It's a miracle I was able to get this to work. It took about, I'll say, a solid 7 or 8 minutes of just my CNUSD page loading before I could even log into it. It's really unusual. Anyhow, folks, I'm just going to try and stay focused here and get through the lecture today because I got to move on with this stuff. So, Voltaire was very influential. He's a deist. He challenges the Catholic Church. We talked about this stuff last time. He also hated bigotry and injustice and sought religious toleration. One of his famous lines, by the way, was quoted in that cartoon, The Family Guy. Years ago, there was an episode about Peter getting his house taken away by the bank, and he walks into his house, and there's another guy living in it. And he goes, "Hey, what are you doing in my house?" And the the guy goes, "Well, the bank took it away from you. It's not your house anymore. They said you couldn't pay your bills because you're a big, stupid idiot." And Peter's response to the guy goes, "Well, sir, although I don't agree with a word you say, I'll defend to the death your right to say it." And that's a quote from Voltaire. "While I don't agree with a word you say, I'll defend to the death your right to say it." And I want you to think about what that quote means in terms of liberty, right? He's talking about freedom of speech. He's talking about even if we don't agree with what somebody says, they have the right to express their individual opinion. And you have the right to express your individual opinion, to counter their opinion and provide evidence that undermines it. Okay? The idea here, though, being that, there's a respect, there's a reverence for freedom of speech. Even if the ideas are disagreeable to you, even if the ideas are not ones that you subscribe to, and so on, freedom of speech is important because if bad ideas get out there, all right, the idea behind freedom of speech is that good ideas can undermine it using reason, using evidence, using an understanding of the natural laws of the universe. All right, and we have very much, I would argue, moved away from this spirit of intellectual discourse. These days, people seemingly have the belief, to take it even a step further, that just because they have an opinion about something, that their opinion is right. And that's where we run into problems, right? We run into problems when all opinions have to be considered valued just because somebody holds them, even if those opinions are not substantiated with reasonable arguments. And that's really the major problem. Yes, so evidently there was a power outage at the school. I'm getting updates via text here. And so, folks, just to let you know, I'm at home, so I don't have a power outage at my home, but the reason that the school's network has been on the fritz is because the school's power just went out, I guess. So just to let you know that could pose some headaches for you later on today, guys. I'm on YouTube with you right now, and YouTube is, of course, a completely separate system from CNUSD's systems. So we won't get disconnected here unless my power goes out at my home. But just to let you know, for other classes today, you may run into some problems because of power issues at the school and possibly also at the district. I'm not sure on that one yet. But I just wanted to make sure that you guys know about that. Anyhow, okay, continuing on here. So that's Voltaire. We talked about how Voltaire also was kind of bumping elbows with some of the more influential political figures of this time. You know, Joseph II, Frederick the Great. He lived in Frederick the Great's court for some time. Catherine the Great he was corresponding with. All right, and then we moved on and we started talking about Baron de Montesquieu, and I reminded you I reminded you about how Baron de Montesquieu was this French guy who admired British government, and he admired the way in which British government was divided into several branches. And these branches of government each had checks and balances that prevented the separate branches from becoming too powerful. And of course, this was a huge impact on our own US Constitution, as well as the French Revolution later on in the 1780s. We wrote the Constitution in about 1787. The French Revolution breaks out in 1789, and Baron de Montesquieu's ideas are very influential on the creation of new republics that are quasi-democratic, where people are able to participate through voting, and where the government's power is divided into three branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. And each of these branches has powers that the other branch doesn't have, and is able to it kind of prevent any of those branches from becoming so powerful that it overtakes the entire government. Moving on to a new guy that we haven't yet talked about. This is JeanJacques Rousseau. JeanJacques Rousseau was a figure that came at the very, very, very tail end of the Enlightenment. Now, I must concede that JeanJacques Rousseau's ideas can be at times a bit contradicting. Rousseau is a very intelligent man, and he thinks about things very critically. However, sometimes teachings of Rousseau seemingly contradict one another, and he can be difficult to understand, and that's why sometimes we say that JeanJacques Rousseau was considered part of the Enlightenment, but also was kind of this transitionary figure that that brought Europe into a new age after the Enlightenment, called the Age of Romanticism, or the Romantic movement. Okay, and so let me tell you a little bit about JeanJacques Rousseau's ideas. Number one, he had a brand new, now we've talked about this term social contract before, going back to Thomas Hobbes, who we learned about a couple of units ago. Thomas Hobbes was an English political thinker who believed that humans were evil, that they were wicked, self-indulgent, and that Thomas Hobbes came up with this idea of a social contract that said that people willingly give up individual freedoms. People willingly give up their right to freedom in return for protection from the government, and that it was expected that the government would necessarily reduce the rights of individuals in return for offering law, order, stability, and protection from foreign invasion. That was really the social contract as Hobbes saw it. Very shortly after, we saw John Locke, who happens to be pictured right here. Okay, this is John Locke. John Locke came in the late 1600s, about a full century before Rousseau. If you'll recall, John Locke had a little bit more optimistic view of mankind. He thought that people could learn from experience. He believed in that same idea of Francis Bacon, of tabula rasa, that people learn from their experiences, that people make mistakes, but that they also learn from their mistakes, and they change their ways, and they can improve society. And John Locke came up with a different idea of the social contract. John Locke's idea of the social contract was one where people had an agreement with government based on the idea that the government governs based on the consent of the people it governs. That is to say, that if a government demonstrates that it is unable to perform its duties as a government, which is to protect life, liberty, and property, what John Locke termed the natural rights of all individuals. All right? Now, in his time, of course, when he said all individuals, he was referring to white, male, typically noble or gentry figures in England who owned land. All right? But these days we have extended the ideas of John Locke's natural rights out to everyone, women, people of different ethnic and religious makeups, and so on and so forth, okay? And so the idea here being that John Locke proposed a new social contract that said that people give the government authority. They consent to be ruled by the government. And that if the government demonstrates that it is not upholding its end of this social contract, that the people then also retain the right to overthrow that government and replace it with a government that will protect their natural rights. And that was the social contract according to John Locke. So the reason I'm talking about this, even though I've just gone on a giant tangent, is to let you know that that phrase, social contract, is one that the definition changes dependent on whose version of the social contract we're talking about. So we could talk about the social contract according to Hobbes, the social contract according to Locke, or the social contract, which was the name of Rousseau's pinnacle work in 1762, according to JeanJacques Rousseau. And JeanJacques Rousseau, in his version of the social contract, emphasizes different things. He believed that there was too much emphasis on government protection of property and not enough consideration of the protection of the people, and that this was a root cause of social injustice, and that if the government focused more on the people and less on the property, okay? Remember that in the list of John Locke's natural rights, life comes first. Life, liberty, freedom, okay, and property is last on the list. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau is taking a look at these natural rights, and he says, it seems to me that the government has a strong interest in protecting property by the 1700s, but not as much of an interest in protecting the people. And it was JeanJacques Rousseau's ideas that he said that the government's job is to consider the general will of the population. In other words, a consensus of the majority should control the nation. And this idea translates into this notion of more Republican-style governments, democratic, representative-style governments, not completely democratic, but at least democratic enough where the government is aware of and concerned with the well-being of the majority of the people of a nation. The way that laws should be made, according to JeanJacques Rousseau's idea, was that if a law was, number one, supported by and in favor of the benefit of most people in society, then that's a law that is good and should stick around. If a law is discriminatory, if a law protects the minority and punishes the majority, that is a bad law that needs to be done away with. These are some of the ideas of JeanJacques Rousseau's social contract. Now, as I said, the reason that we say that JeanJacques Rousseau is kind of an Enlightenment figure and also this transitionary figure that, leads the way into this new intellectual movement of Romanticism in the early 1800s, late 1790s, early 1800s. He basically argues in favor of this idea that, the state of nature is that man was himself a noble savage. And this is where things start to get confusing, because JeanJacques Rousseau had this idea that materialism, property, had a tendency to corrupt civilization. And I must admit that I never was really a huge Rousseau fan, because his works are very complicated and difficult to wrap your head around until more recent years. And the reason that I say that Rousseau has, in terms of somebody who is familiar with this and thinks about it regularly, Rousseau's ideas have become increasingly appealing to me as an individual. In part because I see what has been happening with the trend of social media in modern times. And it appears to me that in modern times, there does seem to be a major emphasis on materialism, that is, property, and people's this need to somehow brag or show people a lens into their lives that is one that portrays their life in a way that is probably not very realistic. All right? And there's a certain corruption that happens when people only emphasize the things in their life that seemingly are valuable on a social level. So when I say this, what I'm referring to is if you ever are scrolling through people's, your feed or whatever, on whatever social media platform that you use, you'll see people who are gloating about having fancy clothes, fancy designer purses or jewelry, or huge homes or vacation villas or I'm sorry, I said houses, but fast cars or expensive goods and other things like that. There's a lot of materialism that people wrap themselves into as being a symbol of their identity. And JeanJacques Rousseau would have been very, very skeptical about this, because he saw very early on the nature of particularly high-class nobles and bourgeois folks who had a propensity for really, grandiose, luxurious lifestyle that was very idealistic but not very good for society. All right. And he said that, in some sense, actually, when you allow people, this is where this noble savage idea comes in to play. He basically says that the Enlightenment exposes, in some sense, the most brutal forms of savagery, and that that there was a corruptive force of the Enlightenment. And it's a confusing thing because we think of the Enlightenment as being something that is enlightening, not corruptive. JeanJacques Rousseau suggested that the reason that the Enlightenment is somewhat corruptive is that as people became more informed about the inner workings of society, there were certain trappings of society that they became enveloped in terms of property and materialism, and that in some sense the very thing that designates you at being at the top of society is also, in a sense, something that seems to take away from your humanity, that in some sense has a way of corrupting the spirit and the natural goodness of people. That if you take a look at people in lesser developed areas, that you don't seem to have the trifles of civilization that you did in the upper echelons of European society at this time, that seemingly allow for people to forget about a simpler state of nature where people look out for the common good of one another. Now let's take something in modern day times that probably Jean-Jacques Rousseau would have been very much in favor of. And I'll use the example of traffic lights and traffic laws. Now, of course, in Rousseau's time, Rousseau did not live in an industrial era. He lived in a pre-industrial era, so he didn't know anything about cars or traffic lights or anything like that. None of it existed in his time. But let's just take the idea of cars and traffic laws and traffic lights and things like that, speed limits in modern day times. Now, when I get into a car, excuse me, when I get into a car, I have one goal. And that's to get to where I'm trying to go. And laws like speed limits, traffic lights, stop signs, and so on are impediments to you getting to where you want to go quickly, right? Because you're forced to stop, all right? I'm just trying to get to where I want to go. I don't want to have to be dealing with traffic lights, stop signs, speed limits, and so on. They're a nuisance. They are, in some sense, if you will, quote unquote, cutting down on my freedom to drive as I want. However, we have to also understand that roads are public. They are not meant for the individual to exploit to their own gain. You are entering into a commonplace when you walk out onto the street and enter into your car and start driving down the road. You are now in a public forum. And what Rousseau would have very much imposed or suggested is that when these laws like traffic lights, stop signs, speed limits are imposed, it's not that people love speed limits. It's not that people love having to sit in traffic or at stoplights or anything like that. It's that we all agree to give up individual freedoms to act however we want for the greater will of the population. That is, I don't just blow through stop signs, stop lights, drive at 1,000,000 miles an hour down the freeway because I understand that I also don't want other people to be doing those things when I'm driving on the roads. Because if they are, that means that they're endangering the lives of people around them. And this is very much akin to the types of lessons that Rousseau taught about. The idea that people, when it comes to looking out for other human beings, that there are certain freedoms that we are willing to sacrifice for the general will of the population. I don't like paying taxes, right? Every time I get paid. I don't necessarily like paying taxes, but I know that by paying my taxes, I am contributing to public services that operate on behalf of the good of the population, right? Police, fire services, public libraries, schools, you name it. There are all sorts of different ways in which my tax dollars go to pay for services that benefit everybody. And I am willing to pay a certain amount in taxes for the greater good of the population. Again, the idea being that it's okay to stop emphasizing, certain freedoms and liberties and property rights and all of these other things, if we understand that that it is for the benefit of all of society. And that is the best way that I can describe JeanJacques Rousseau's Enlightenment ideas. All right, moving on to the next guy that we're going to be talking about here. His name is Denis Diderot. Now, Denis Diderot wrote the first encyclopedia. All right, the First Encyclopedia, and it was probably the most representative work of the philosophes, because what he does is not everything that was written in the encyclopedia by Denis Diderot was by him. He's the editor of the encyclopedia. That means that he chooses what articles, what ideas go into it. Nonetheless, it's basically a giant compendium of knowledge. Think of it very similar to the way that Wikipedia works, right? Wikipedia is essentially an online encyclopedia that has all sorts of different contributors to it that you're able to freely access. Now, back in the olden days, when I was a kid growing up, Wikipedia didn't exist yet because the internet was still in its infancy when I was a kid. And so Wikipedia really wasn't a thing. And when it started to become a thing, Wikipedia was not exactly a super reliable source. These days, I think Wikipedia is better than it used to be. Still not considered a super scholarly academic source, but if you're looking to figure the basics of something out really quickly, Wikipedia is really cool because we all like being able to look at a trusted source that has citations and other things that we can draw upon to learn new information. Wikipedia is an amazing tool. It's a free tool that shares information. We are entering into the last 10 years. We've entered into this thing where we do a lot of sharing, between ride sharing or sharing of answers on you name it, on assignments, or sharing of information, or sharing of our lives on social media. People are really into sharing. And in some ways that's good, in other things that's bad. But nonetheless, this idea of sharing information is really, really cool. And Denis Diderot recognized very early on that if there was a central compendium of knowledge that allowed for the dissemination of the ideas of the Enlightenment to reach more people, that would benefit the rest of society by sharing this information. So he started to popularize, using this encyclopedia, this compendium of knowledge, the views of the philosophes. And he began to very strongly emphasize science and reason, starting to criticize religion and the role that it has in preventing people from thinking as individuals, as opposed to just accepting the doctrines of various religions. Also emphasizing criticizing rather intolerance, criticizing injustices, criticizing tyranny, all of these ideas that are fundamental to the Enlightenment. Okay, the encyclopedia gets banned in France. Why would the French government ban, or the French Catholic Church ban or even just the entire Catholic Church by the Pope ban the encyclopedia? Well, because by the time that we get to the Enlightenment, this clear conflict has developed between scientific thinking and spiritual dogma, okay, spiritual teachings, where spiritual teachings were dictated by the church, and whatever the church told you, you were to believe in. The philosophers principally disagree with that idea. The philosophers emphasized that individuals needed to use reason, needed to understand the laws of nature in order to be able to be informed participants of the intellectual community. That a person who only derived their understanding of the world through religion was one that was kind of, drinking the Kool-Aid of the Catholic Church at the time or of any of the Protestant faiths, and not thinking for themselves, not having individual reason, but instead just subscribing to the beliefs of an institution that has tried to deliberately prevent the spread of teachings that directly undermine the church's tenets. So, the encyclopedia was placed on the banned book list in France. It was placed on the index of forbidden books by the Pope, and it becomes considered essentially, controversial material that they don't want spreading around intellectual groups. All right? So that's Denis Diderot. Marquis de Bacaria on Crimes and Punishment was the piece that he wrote. Marquis de Bacaria was another philosopher of this time who emphasized a different aspect of Enlightenment teachings, looking this time more at crime and punishment. And it was the belief of many philosophers, but especially Bacaria at this time, by the mid-1700s, that things like the death penalty, things like corporal punishment, where people were physically punished by way of torture techniques that were very commonplace in Europe going back several hundred years to the medieval era and before, that these kinds of punishments were inherently unjust, that they inherently went against these ideas of the right to life, okay, people's natural rights. That by torturing somebody, by killing somebody in a state-sanctioned execution, that these were principles that undermined the Enlightenment and needed to be reformed. Also, the administration of justice, where sometimes it was very commonplace back in the olden days, less so in England, more so in places like Prussia or Russia, where you saw more absolutist style governments. People who were at the upper top echelon of society were able to get by with crimes and get light punishments, or even sometimes no punishments at all. If the same crime had been committed by, let's say, a lower standing person on the social economic hierarchy, that person may have received a more severe punishment involving physical torture or other things like that. And just the entire process of the criminal justice system. These days in the criminal justice system, which I will admit, even in our modern times, is not perfect and probably could do with some reforms, all right? Nonetheless, it's still much, much better than it used to be back in the olden days when there was no due process of law. Now, if you've never heard of the phrase due process of law before, what that refers to is that the law, and when people are arrested for breaking it, that the processes surrounding people going to jail, people going to court, how the trial works, so on and so forth, everything takes on a known, orderly, predictable format, and it takes the same format for everyone, regardless of what class. Everyone is supposed to be equal before the law, and that the laws should be, when they're broken, that the criminals should be handled in the same way, regardless of whoever you are, whether you're super wealthy or whether you're really poor. All right? And so that's why when we see like episodes of Cops and stuff back from the 90s or early 2000s, you'll see in Cops that everything goes through the same process. There's a traffic stop, there's usually some questioning. If a person has been found in possession of drugs or whatever else, doing something that they shouldn't be, they are arrested and read their Miranda rights. That's the first step in the due process of laws once you've become arrested, is that you are read your Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford an attorney, one will be provided to you by the state, and so on and so forth. These kinds of rights are read to people because of this idea that people should know the legal process. Not many people know the legal process, right? People should know it before they become a victim of, or rather the judicial process, and the laws surrounding the judicial process is really what I'm referring to here. And you go to jail, you are told what you are being held for, you have the right to an attorney at that time, and then you can post, they'll give you, you'll have a hearing in court. Once you have your court hearing, bail will be set. At that point, you can pay bail to temporarily get yourself out of jail until your trial starts. When your criminal trial starts, then there's a known orderly process that takes, where you have the prosecution and the defense and so on and so forth, and all of these rules and regulations that surround the actual trial itself, including jury selection and all of that other stuff. But it all works the same way. It's that once you learn the process, it works more or less the same way for every criminal court case. And then civil court cases have their own processes that they follow, and you don't go to jail for those ones usually. Sometimes you can, I guess, but generally speaking, there are kind of these processes depending on the laws that we're talking about. And these ideas, and I know again I've gone on a huge tangent, but I just want to make sure that I'm talking about this in a way that makes sense to you guys. These ideas are really the inspiration from Marquis de Bacaria, all right, or Bacaria. And so he's trying to humanize criminal law based on Enlightenment concepts of reason and equality before the law. He's not saying that everyone in society should be equal. He's not advocating for, equal distribution of wealth in a communist state by any stretch of the imagination. That is not what he's saying here. What he's saying here is that regardless of what segment of the society you come from, that the law should work the same for everyone. He was also in opposition to the death penalty, and he opposed torture to extract confessions from people, because when you're being tortured, people will pretty much just say anything, even if they're lying, just to get the torture to stop. And his ideas definitely influenced several enlightened despots who we'll be talking about later on this week. Frederick the Great, for example, banned torture. Catherine the Great initially, at least, restricted the use of torture, but she kind of goes back on that a little bit. And then Joseph II both banned torture and banned the death penalty. Joseph II being the most radical of the enlightened despots, the rulers of Europe that begin to embrace the teachings of the Enlightenment in the mid to late 1700s. Now, in addition to some of the ideas about politics and society that we have been talking about, we also have to understand that during the Enlightenment, we saw some new ideas surrounding economics. First proposed by, perhaps, Francois Quesnay. Now, Quesnay was the leader of what became known as the Physiocrat movement in France. And the Physiocrats opposed mercantilism, but supported capitalism. The idea here being that the economy, in the eyes of these early Enlightenment economists, should function similarly to nature, in the sense that there were known predictable laws of economics that would flourish if European governments began to move away from the highly regulatory systems of mercantilism and move into the much more liberal and free policies of capitalism. And as you guys probably know today, mercantilism is essentially a dead economic policy that these days, and for the last several hundred years, but especially in the last 40 years, we have seen on an international level a push towards a much freer economy where regulations on trade have been reduced, okay, where there are more open exchanges between nations in terms of trade than there ever used to be back in the era of the 15, 16, and 1700s, when mercantilism was the dominant economic policy. And we've talked a lot about mercantilism and the ideas of tariffs and taxation and regulation and establishing colonies and all of those ideas. The idea being that everybody is competing for the same sized pie of wealth because the amount of wealth is limited. In capitalism, which is the economic theory that becomes popularized during the Enlightenment, capitalism advocates for the deregulation of the economy, to take away regulations, to take away tariffs, to remove taxes, to promote free trade. And so, Francois Quesnay and the Physiocrats sought to reform the existing agrarian system by instituting laissez-faire ideas in agriculture. Now, that term laissez-faire is one that you're going to want to know about. Laissez-faire translates quite literally to let do, okay? Let do. Let do, meaning let the economy do what it wants to do. Don't force the economy through regulation and laws and tariffs to be altered, okay? Let the economy be free, just like we should let the planets be free, people be free, societies be free, and so on, all right? That if you take these, if you take governmental and noble control away from them, that you will produce more in your economy. All right. Quesnay and other economists of this time believed that the government had way too much control over the economy, and what this ultimately did was it stifled production. It prevented economies from being as productive as they could be. And the guy that really takes this idea and runs with it is a guy by the name of Adam Smith, who wrote a piece called Wealth of Nations in 1776, which also happens to be the same year that the Americans broke away from Britain and established the United States. And this piece, The Wealth of Nations, it's considered in many ways the Bible of capitalism. Adam Smith is very much considered like the father of modern capitalism, because he refined and expanded those ideas of the Physiocrats by suggesting 3 natural laws of a capitalist society. And the 3 laws of a capitalist society that Adam Smith outlines in Wealth of Nations is, number 1, the law of self-interest. What Adam Smith said is that because humans are capable of being rational, that humans are capable of making their own decisions, that when it comes to decisions in the marketplace, in terms of choices of products or services that they wish to purchase, all right, that people should be free to make those decisions on their own, that they should not have restrictions placed on them in the forms of tariffs and other things that alter people's individual decisions to make economic choices on their own. Now, what we have to understand is that as I talk about Adam Smith, I need to be clear about the teachings that he proposes, but I also need to be clear that the teachings that Adam Smith proposes about liberal economics, free economics, capitalism, all right, are themselves troublesome in some other ways. See, Adam Smith's ideas are really inherently widely accepted by Americans because Americans value capitalistic economies. All right, we value freedom of choice, we value capitalism, and all of us, regardless of your feelings on capitalism, all of us, you must concede, benefit from a system of capitalism here in Southern California, where we have a whole wealth of products and services that are offered to us that we can choose to buy. And in a large part, that's a good thing for us. However, to get back to this idea of self-interest, this is a problem that can be troublesome over time, because if there are absolutely no regulations placed on private companies, all right, and again, that's the emphasis of capitalism, is that, you have to understand that mercantilism, of course, had resulted in things like monopolies, where the British had given monopolies to, say, the British East India Company for the trade of tea, or they had given monopolies to the, British African Company, okay, or I forget what the Royal African Company. Okay, the Royal African Company had a monopoly on the slave trade, all right, or the Virginia Company had a monopoly on the development of Virginia as a colony, all right. What these guys are saying is that monopolies are troublesome. What is also troublesome, though, about capitalism is that essentially, if you give businesses complete freedom, and if you give people total freedom, sometimes people make decisions not in their best interest. And that's where you really run into problems. The most recent example that I can really point to as a product of deregulating the economy too much is that in the early 2000s, the American government under George W. Bush deregulated the banking industry. Now, what do private companies always want to do? They want to make money, right? Private companies have one thing in mind, and it's profit. And what happens when you get extremely successful companies that are really big and really powerful, what can happen is that large companies begin to buy smaller companies and absorb them. And over time, what this can result in is quasi-monopolistic companies developing. And in the banking industry, the way that this manifested was that because banks were getting big, and because the banks did not have as many regulations, and the banks are trying to make money, people went to the banks and started taking out loans, particularly mortgage loans, meaning home loans, to buy houses that they couldn't afford. And the bank, being that they were looking at making a lot of money, was willfully giving out loans to people, very risky loans to people at very high interest rates, that the bank knew that people likely would not be able to pay back. And the reason that that's a problem is because, of course, people would love to buy a house. Buying a house is a really big deal when it comes to, your economic independence, because houses are very, very good economic investments. So it stands to reason that an individual making a sound choice for their own lives is going to try to get a home loan to purchase a house. That seemingly on the surface is a rational economic decision. However, when they are making this decision, they are also in some sense being irrational in the sense that they are taking out a loan that is at a very high interest rate that they are going to have a very difficult time paying back. And in many cases, they did not pay these loans back. And what this contributed to in the early 2000s as a direct result of the very principles that we're talking about here is that the banks ultimately found themselves in a very bad position because they had given out all of these loans to people that they now could not pay back. And when you cannot pay back your loans to the bank has their own way of making your life miserable by then taking away your house that the bank gave you money to buy and is technically the bank's property. And the bank had a whole bunch of houses. But the bank doesn't want to deal in houses. Banks deal in money. So when the bank took over all these homes, the banks, there was this huge supply of homes on the market. The prices of the homes fell, because the banks are trying to unload these homes as fast as they could. And what was happening was that the bank continued to give out loans for overvalued properties to people that couldn't pay back the loans. And this resulted in, over time, a recession, a very huge economic recession in the United States because of people not having homes, being in extraordinary amounts of debts, having to declare bankruptcy, and all of these other things. And so it had this multiple, precipitous effect where one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another, where the economy was completely flipped upside down and people were making choices that were not very rational. All right? And this is a problem when it comes to overly free economies. You need to have some regulation in your economy to make sure that businesses remain competitive, that businesses don't turn the marketplace into a predatory environment for individual consumers. And there are other ways in which this happens as well. You may know that in modern times, very recently, there's a class action lawsuit against Google, for kind of monopolistic type data collection sort of lawsuit. All right, because there are not many competitors that can keep up with Google in terms of its influence across the internet. Right? Or you name it. There's other examples. Walmart could be another example. In the late 90s, Walmart was going into all these different places. They were buying out all of their competition in these places so that before long, the only place that you have to shop is Walmart. And once again, people think based on the law of self-interest, according to Adam Smith, people think they're making a rational decision by showing up at Walmart and buying goods for the lowest prices. On the surface, this is a rational economic decision. Why would I pay $2 more for a bottle of Windex when I could get it for $2 less at Walmart? And the long scheme, again, this results in a precipitous, this one thing leads to another sort of outcome. Because what happens is the more people shop at Walmart, the wealthier Walmart becomes, and the easier it becomes for Walmart to continue to buy out other businesses and reduce competition. So that before long, the only place that you have to shop is Walmart. And once again, we have found ourselves in a quasi-monopolistic type environment, which is something that Adam Smith would not have thought to be good. And so these kinds of things, we have to understand that if we look at the economy, we have to consider it as being not just like a light switch where it's either on or off. It has to be more like those fancy light switches where you can gradually turn the lights on over the course of a spectrum. The fancy light switches where you can like dim the lights from full all the way down to complete darkness. And that's really how we have to think about the economy. If we slide the slider all the way over to freedom, what we have seen happen across the course of history, particularly during the Industrial Revolution, is that there are some bad effects that happen if your economy is overly free. because large companies will ultimately create a predatory environment for laborers and for consumers that result in a decrease in their quality of life. Okay, the other two laws, to finish up Adam Smith, the other two laws that he advocated for were number 2, the law of competition. The idea being here that if you don't have government-supported monopolies anymore, but instead allow for many private companies to compete with one another, what this will do is it will lower prices and improve the quality of goods that we are able to purchase, because businesses will compete with one another for everyone else's business. And this is the idea of the law of competition. The third law of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is the law of supply and demand. This sometimes gets nicknamed the invisible hand. The idea that if you allow for the natural drives of supply and demand to dictate the economy, that the prices of goods will come to a natural balance point. That there was an invisible hand of supply and demand that negotiated the economy without needing to have laws made surrounding what the price of goods should be. And the reason we talk about this one is because remember that back in the olden days under mercantilism, there were a lot of regulations, taxes, tariffs that artificially increased the price of goods. This famously happened in Britain in the early days of the Industrial Revolution with something known as the Corn Laws, which we'll talk more about at the start of next semester when we get to about January or February. What the Corn Laws did in Britain is it artificially raised the price of grain. Now, I know that they're called the Corn Laws, but they're not really talking about corn as we think about, like corn on the cob. In Britain, when people said corn, they were actually referring to things like wheat, barley, oats, grains, things like that. And what the British government did was the foreign price of grain was really cheap. And people started buying cheap foreign grain that was grown outside of Britain. So Britain's government response to this was to control the price of foreign grain by artificially raising the price of grain higher than British grown grain. Now, people in England hated this law, of course, because people literally relied on grain to survive. Okay, you need to eat to live. And so, the idea here was that there shouldn't be artificial taxes on particularly grain, which people need to survive, where now your lower classes have to pay a huge amount more money just to be able to eat, so that the pockets of wealthy British grain growers will continue to be stuffed with extra profits so that they don't lose money. And this is the reason that Adam Smith advocated for the invisible hand. He said that the price of goods will automatically be determined by, number one, how much of that good is available, the supply of that good, and number two, how much people want that good or service. In other words, the demand of that service. And that the economy should be governed by how much stuff there is of a particular good and how much people want that particular good or service, and how much they're willing to pay for it. All right? So you don't need the government to determine the costs of goods. All right, folks. That brings me to the end of my lecture today. Sorry for the late start and the technical difficulties we had, but I'm glad we were able to get through where I wanted to get to today. There will be a new assignment posted on Canvas as soon as I'm able to get Canvas to work again. and be looking out for that, and that will be due on Wednesday, and it'll be mostly pertaining to the kinds of things we talked about in today's lecture. All right, have a great Monday, and we'll see you back on Wednesday.